Good evening. According to a new bombshell report, the FBI, as well as several other federal agencies, they spent over $500 million on informants over the course of the last several years, with many of these informants committing what they're calling authorized crimes. Meanwhile, over in Pennsylvania, 5 days ago, the state Supreme Court, it ruled in favor of parents, and they officially threw out the mask mandate that was being imposed on schools. And then likewise, right here in the state of New York, while the governor has imposed a statewide indoor mask mandate, over a quarter of the counties in the state, they openly said that they will not be complying with what they're calling tyrannical dictates. Let's go through it all together. This is your daily Facts Matter update, and I'm your host, Roman, from the Epoch Times. And now let's begin today's discussion by talking about government informants. Now, a new bombshell report was just released a few days ago, and it found that the FBI, as well as several other federal agencies, they spent about $548 million on informants over the course of the last several years, with many of these informants committing authorized crimes. Again, that's over $500 million. Now, to start with, this report was compiled by Mr. Adam Andrzejewski, who is the founder of OpenTheBooks.com, which is a government transparency watchdog. And according to their team of auditors who dug through the federal reports and compiled this information, the FBI, the DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Agency, as well as the ATF, which is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, they gave a combined $548 million to informants over the course of the last several years. Which, frankly, if you have been to any conservative event over the last few months, you have likely noticed for yourself. Now, to break down some of these numbers, here's what the Department of Justice's Inspector General reported regarding these three agencies. Although, mind you, some of these numbers are a little dated, but they are still some of the most recent data that we have access to. So let's start with the FBI. Between the fiscal years of 2012 and 2018, the FBI spent an average of $42 million per year on confidential human sources, with what they refer to as long-term informants comprising a full 20% of those relationships. Then, in regards to the ATF, between the fiscal years of 2012 and 2015, they employed 1,855 informants who were paid $4.3 million annually. And so when you do the math, on average, each one of those informants, they made about $2,318 per year. Although I should mention that some of these informants, they made a lot more than that, but we will get to that in a second. Now, the third agency, which is the DEA, between the years of 2010 and 2015, they had about 18,000 active informants. Here's, in fact, what the Inspector General wrote specifically about the DEA, quote, "One federal agency, the DEA, had over 18,000 active confidential sources assigned to its domestic offices, with over 9,000 of those sources receiving approximately $237 million in payments for information or services they provided to the DEA between October 1st of 2010 and September 30th of 2015. However, as I mentioned earlier, some informants made a lot more than others. In fact, according to the Justice Department's Inspector General, out of these high-earning informants, they include, quote, an airline employee who received more than $600,000 in less than 4 years, and a parcel employee who received over $1 million in 5 years, which is pretty good for someone working in the post office. Furthermore, during his audit, the Inspector General found that the DEA was giving large amounts of money to employees of the TSA as well as Amtrak. Here's, in fact, what he wrote on this front, quote, "During this audit, we found that between fiscal years 2011 and 2015, the DEA actually used at least 33 Amtrak employees and 8 TSA employees as sources, paying the Amtrak employees over $1.5 million and the TSA employees over $94,000. Specifically, though, in this report, he singled out one Amtrak employee who, between the years of 2010 and 2015, made a staggering $962,000 to be an informant for the government. However, you might look at that information and you might say, well, Roman, that's okay, because maybe that particular Amtrak employee, he was feeding the federal government really vital information about something like smuggling. However, that does not seem to be the case, because according to the Inspector General, despite the fact that this particular Amtrak employee was paid close to $1 million, the information that he actually provided to the government, quote, could have been obtained by DEA at no cost through a joint task force with the Amtrak police. And then, besides the questionable nature of this information, it appears that there were instances of out-and-out corruption. That's because included in this report was information that came out of a Congressional Oversight Committee hearing where Jason Chaffetz, who was a congressman from Utah, and he was also the former chairman of the Congressional Oversight Committee, and here's what he said, quote, "A court released the testimony of one confidential informant in Atlanta who received $212,000 from the DEA from 2011 to 2013. She testified she wasn't sure why she was paid. That was her testimony. She also testified to a sexual relationship with the DEA group supervisor who allegedly convinced the subordinates to falsify reports to justify the payments. That case is currently under review by the Inspector General." And to be frank with you, it's exactly reports like these that make me question why I pay taxes every year. Now, besides our government paying for useless information and engaging in potential sexual corruption, this report also goes on to expose how these informants engaged in actual, what they called authorized crime, meaning that the crime that was committed by these informants, it was done with the express permission of their federal handlers. Which, if you've seen any crime movies, for instance, like the movies about the mob, you know that it's not that uncommon. In fact, here's how a 2015 audit from the General Accountability Office describes the reality of authorized crimes. Since 1980, the guidelines have permitted agencies to authorize informants to engage in activities that would otherwise constitute crimes under federal, state, or local law if someone without such authorization engaged in these same activities. For example, in the appropriate circumstance, an agency could authorize an informant to purchase illegal drugs from someone who is the target of a drug trafficking investigation. Such conduct is termed otherwise illegal activity. The guidelines include certain requirements when authorizing otherwise illegal activity and restrictions on the types of activities an agency can authorize. In particular, the guidelines prohibit agencies from authorizing an informant to participate in an act of violence, obstruction of justice, and other enumerated unlawful activities. Now, in terms of how many of these authorized crimes have been committed over the past few years, well, it looks like there have been many. In fact, according to documents that were obtained by the Daily Dot via a Freedom of Information Act request, they found that, quote, "In total, records obtained by reporters confirm that the FBI authorized at least 22,823 crimes between 2011 and 2014. And again, notice that that data is fairly old. It only stops at 2014. However, let's look at a more recent example of one of these authorized crimes that took place just a few months ago. And I'm talking about the kidnapping plot against Michigan's governor, Ms. Gretchen Whitmer. Now, you might have heard about this particular plot. In short, there were over a dozen men who were allegedly planning to kidnap the governor. However, when the case actually went before a court, during the proceedings, the federal government, they came out and they shared the ID numbers of at least 12 confidential informants who were involved in the kidnapping plot. Now, even though they refused to provide either the methods that were used for the recruitment, how much these informants were paid, their locations, or their names, at what point does this kidnapping become a government operation? Because if you look at the facts and consider that 12 of the men who were involved in this kidnapping plot, meaning that the overwhelming majority of those who were involved were actually working for the government, then what does that actually mean for the whole thing? And these informants, they were not just flies in the wall. Instead, they were allegedly heavily involved in the inception and planning of this kidnapping. Here's in fact how BuzzFeed News described the situation, which, by the way, in this case, BuzzFeed News did a phenomenal job covering the story. Here's what they wrote. An examination of the case by BuzzFeed News also reveals that some of those informants, acting under the direction of the FBI, played a far larger role than has previously been reported. Working in secret, they did more than just passively observe and report on the actions of the suspects. Instead, they had a hand in nearly every aspect of the alleged plot, starting with its inception. The extent of their involvement raises questions as to whether there would have even been a conspiracy without them. Which, frankly, is shocking enough, but then they go on to further state that some of these informants, they were actually helping the entire thing take root. Here's what they wrote. A longtime government informant from Wisconsin, for example, helped organize a series of meetings around the country where many of the alleged plotters first met one another and the earliest notions of a plan took root, some of those people say. The Wisconsin informant even paid for some hotel rooms and food as an incentive to get people to come. And I wonder where that money that the informant was spending on the food and the hotel rooms was actually coming from. Very likely from you and me, the American taxpayers. Regardless, if you'd like to read more about this report that came out regarding these FBI informants, I will throw the link to it. It'll be the link to the PDF version of it into the description box below this video for you to check out. And all I ask in return is that if you haven't already, take a quick moment to smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm.